Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Are we making it? Are you doing okay? Are we hanging in there? I know we're all feeling a sense of, foreboding a bit, but I just want to say this is the perfect event then for today. We're going to be talking about hope in teaching and learning. So we are all in this together, and I just want to say from A.P.E.X to every single one of you, thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing to our events and making this kind of great collaboration and sharing possible. So our guest today is Kevin Gannon, and he currently serves as the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and he's also a professor of history at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa. He's been there since 2004. His teaching and research and public work and writing centers on critical and inclusive pedagogy, aka method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. His book is called Radical Hope, A Teaching Manifesto, and we have copies for sale today. Some of us in the room have already read Radical Hope, and I just want to say it has been such a joy to really have that as something that can guide us through last semester and this semester. The reading groups that I've been a part of with it, it's just been such an amazing opportunity to dig in and really talk about how do we continue this concept of hope? How do we stand for a concept of radical hope in our teaching and our learning? So I'm really happy to be introducing Kevin and to allow him to talk about it from his own words. It's been a real joy to do that. That's what we do here. That's what we believe in. And I really love the message that he has to offer. So without further ado, please welcome Kevin Gannon.
Good morning. The lights are and my glasses are really scratched, so it's a really cool kaleidoscopic effect that adds to the ambiance in here. So thank you for being here. Thanks to Lynn and the A.P.E.X crew for inviting me to come join you, to be in community with you all today. I was looking at the folks in that introductory video, and I'm thinking, I'm kind of bringing the property values down here a little bit. So it really is. It's an honor, it's a privilege, and anytime that we can be in community in an institution of higher learning to really talk and think deeply about what it is we do, but why we're doing it, and maybe might we imagine some different ways of approaching those questions. Anytime we get to do that, I count as a net positive. And so as Lynn mentioned, I wrote a book called Radical Hope, A Teaching Manifesto, and its official release date was April 1st, 2020. Which was excellent timing, and what happened was I would get a lot of communication from folks who were like, all right, hope guy, explain the global pandemic, right? Like, what are we gonna do? And so what that got me thinking about, of course, and what has occupied a lot of my thought since is, what does it mean now to think about a pedagogy of hope? And I tend to approach the term pedagogy with a really broad lens. So for me, pedagogy isn't just, the kind of discrete methods that we might use in a classroom. To me, pedagogy is like a set of lenses, hopefully less scratched than mine, that we look through at this higher education world around us. So our pedagogical theory, if you will, is addressed to such questions as, how do people learn best? What does it mean that people learn differently? What do I think success looks like? What kind of academic community am I in, and what are its goals? And how do I, as an individual educator, do my best to help meet those goals? What does all of this stuff look like in practice, right? So it's a set of theoretical lenses that I'm examining my day-to-day world of teaching through. And so our pedagogy influences, if you're a student, it influences how you learn. How do I learn best? What is important to me? What are my values as a student? What does success look like for me? Why am I here? Nice, easy questions, right? And for an educator, a pedagogical vision is how do I help my students build what success looks like for them? When the answer to those questions is probably going to be different for each one of my students. So those are the lenses I'm looking through at, what might seem to be, quotidian, routine, mundane, everyday decisions. How do I write a syllabus? What am I doing in class next Tuesday? How do I facilitate a discussion? What course materials do I choose for students? So it goes from that granular level, but all the way up to what we might call the institutional strategic level as well. So how does the institution in which we're working, how does it allocate resources? What's its mission? How does it live the values of that mission on a day-to-day basis, right? And so all of these questions fit together. Ideally, from the institutional level to the individual level, these things are in alignment with one another. But in the day and age that we're in now, that sort of larger thinking about alignment and connections is really hard because we're really just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis doing this thing, right? So we talked about in COVID pandemic, everyone said, well, we went into online learning. We didn't go into online learning. We went into emergency remote instruction, right? And there's a difference. And we all sort of treaded water, and we did the best we could. And when you think about it, moving the entire United States system of higher education online basically over spring break, that's pretty impressive, right? But it was a heavy lift, and we have been reeling from that, trying to play catch up from that ever since. And so it is really hard in the sort of, just trying to keep my head above water sense to think of those broader questions, right? Why am I doing all of this, right? Why am I even trying to tread water? Is it worth it? And so thinking about our pedagogy, and in particular, I would argue the imperative to ground that pedagogy in an ethic that is shaped fundamentally by hope is more important now in the world of higher education than it's ever been. Because it's not just the COVID pandemic, which isn't over, by the way, as much as we're trying to perhaps pretend that it is. It's not just a viral pandemic that is afflicting us and that is shaping our world, although that is one of the most important realities in our life today, right? But in the beginnings of COVID-19, when scenes like this were common outside of urban hospitals, for example, a lot of the rhetoric we heard was, we need to work together, we need to flatten the curve, right? Remember flatten the curve? Stop the spread, we need to all pitch in and do our part and we'll beat this thing. But now it's here. We're gonna have to learn to live with it, I guess, right? And that's kind of dismaying. In one sense, moving from, an epidemic to something that's endemic, like the cold and the flu and all the things that we've heard about, that does signal some sort of transition, but how we got there, maybe not the greatest path to take, right? How do we preserve hope in an environment that is now being shaped by this thing and all of the damage and havoc that it has wrought? Because we know COVID was not an epidemic that operated equally or equitably upon communities. Underserved and historically marginalized communities in the United States felt the impact of COVID worse, not just in terms of the disease and immediate health outcomes, but also in the economic effects, the educational and access effects as well. And so this is one way of visualizing some of the data on equity, and here looking at the African American community in the United States. But we could slice and dice the COVID data in a number of different ways and see these tremendous types of gaps exist. So COVID discriminates. COVID was also, again, not the only epidemic we face. So against the backdrop of a slow-rolling global pandemic, we had the eruptions of white supremacist violence that shook areas of the United States society as we were all trying to collectively deal with this pandemic trauma. So the events that happened, the anti-Asian violence that we saw in Atlanta, for example, about a year ago, which it seems weird to say a year ago because it feels simultaneously like 2 minutes and 20 days ago, or 20 years ago, right? In the halls of the nation's capital. And before that, much of the backlash I think that we're seeing now, white supremacist-inspired violence, is a backlash to the broad-based social movements that took to the streets in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor to try and force a reckoning with racial injustice, inequities, and the social systems which fail to function in the ways that this society's ideals demand. So I'm trained as a historian. And I think sometimes in the field of history, we overuse the term crisis. It makes for really good chapter titles in textbooks, so we tend to abuse the term a little bit, the crisis of blank, right? But in my professional judgment, I think that this is a relevant, because where are we now if we're not at a crisis moment? The Italian philosopher and newspaper editor Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned in the 1920s and into the early 1930s. He was one of the earliest and most vocal opponents to the new fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, who had taken power in the 20s in Italy and began to rule in an ethno-nationalist, authoritarian, violent state. And Gramsci, as one of the earliest and most vocal critics, he was also one of the first political prisoners of the Mussolini regime. And in fact, prison so shattered Gramsci's health that he was released finally on humanitarian grounds after several years and died within 6 months of being freed from prison. It had absolutely shattered him physically. While he was in prison, Gramsci continued to do what his vocation demanded of him. He was a thinker, an intellectual, a writer, an activist. And so wrestling with these questions, even if he was removed from the day-to-day efforts to wrestle with them and to deal with them in the streets. And so Gramsci's big question was basically, how did we get here? Right? How did we move from a government that was at least nominally committed to principles of liberty and liberalism in the classic sense to fascism, to ugly, chauvinistic, brutal nationalism? And what Gramsci argued is that this was a symptom of a larger crisis. The crisis, he said, consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new has yet to be born. And we live in this in-between moment, he said. The new cannot be born yet, and it's in this interregnum, this period, that we see a great variety of morbid symptoms. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Morbid, death. A society that was dying. A society that was necrotizing. A society that had been riven by historic levels of inequality, that had been riven by violently expressed cultural chauvinism, by a sort of national malaise that was rooted in some of these economic difficulties, an increasing turn to violence instead of normal political channels, morbid symptoms, familiar symptoms. The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek offered a translation of Gramsci's work recently, and in that translation, Zizek approached this famous quote from Gramsci with, very sort of vivid, dramatic language. If you've ever read Zizek, vivid, dramatic language is kind of his jam. But here's how he translated this passage from Gramsci. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Now is the time of monsters. Overwrought? What is historic levels of socioeconomic inequality but a monstrous problem? What is a lack of access to health care for some of the most needy and marginalized communities in our society, if not a monstrous problem? What are political decisions that are made in terms of formal and procedural issues that actually greatly affect ordinary Americans' access to the political system, if not a monstrous problem? The time of monsters. So at this point, you're probably thinking, this is the worst talk on hope that I've ever heard. Way to lead, way to sell. But I dwell in this not because it's fun, but because if we don't tell ourselves the truth, then we cannot ever have realistic hope to guide our actions to create a better world, a better community, a better future. whether it's in the individual spaces in which we live or speaking broadly socioculturally. Without an unflinching honesty about where we've been and where we are now, we have no idea where we want to go. And if we lie to ourselves about where we've been and where we are now, then we will lie to ourselves about where we're going also. So in our world of higher education then, what does a pedagogical praxis, that is the combination of both theory and practice, right? Those things working together. What does a praxis rooted in hope look like? And in particular, what does a praxis rooted in hope look like during our time of monsters? Colleges don't exist in a vacuum. Teachers and students and staff do not exist in a vacuum. We come onto campus, whether it's a virtual or a physical campus, from an outside world that is riven by these structures of inequity. We have taken different paths and different roads to get to where we are now, but here we are now together. How do we address what's outside? How do we address the monstrous problems that our society faces? I emphasize higher education because I think that higher education is uniquely and powerfully positioned to be that agent of change. Where else do we already have a structure that could model the type of future that we want? If I can have a classroom of 35 students, none of whom knew each other before the semester started, coming from different walks of life, rural Iowa farm kids who've never been in the same room as a black person before they came to college, and a kid from the south side of Chicago, and an immigrant from Burma, and a refugee from South Sudan. If I could have all of these in a small college in Des Moines, Iowa, working together to understand medieval history, if we could do that in college, what model does that offer to society? We are a space, at our best, we are a space of possibilities. Revolutions are acts of hope. Exasperation or frustration or angst are other ways to translate this phrase. The Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin said it's this thing that drives people to revolt, but it's hope that makes revolutions. So in other words, being angry and breaking stuff isn't really a revolutionary act. Revolting in favor of something better and having the courage to enact that vision, that's what makes revolutions. Revolutions don't necessarily mean storm the Bastille, put up barricades, blow stuff up. Revolutions are often behind the scenes, process-oriented, and just as dramatic in their outcomes for being less visible. What does a revolution in higher education based on hope look like? And so let's sit with this idea of hope for a second, because hope is one of those terms that we often use in such an expandable, kind of almost interchangeable way that we lose some of the power and we lose some of the meaning behind it, right? So if you think about hope in the sort of Hallmark card sense of the term, right? I have hope in the future. We hear that a lot. Well, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Sometimes I'll hear, well, I have hope in the future because the next generation will build a better future. As if now I don't have to do anything, right? It's the kids' job now. Well, that's been happening for generations and generations, and we've been kind of spinning our wheels, right? Hope without action is fantasy. Meaningful hope is action-oriented. Hope is a verb as well as a noun. So Rebecca Solnit in her excellent essay, Hope in the Dark. How do you find hope in the darkest times is the question that Solnit was asking as she wrote this. And what she meant by hope, she paused on it to think about, hope as an action process-oriented term. Hope, she wrote, is not a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and just clutch feeling lucky. It is an axe that you break down the doors with in an emergency. To hope is to give yourself to the future. And that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. How do we make our present inhabitable? I'm a big fan of anything that will help me figure out how to do that, right? Now, this may seem like a vivid metaphor that Solnit's using. The first time I read this metaphor, the picture that immediately popped in my head was that scene from The Shining with Jack Nicholson axing through the door. Here's Johnny, right? which may not be the one that aligns with what Sultan is talking about, but that vividness is important, right? Hope is the axe that we break down doors with in an emergency. So it's not enough just to say, I'm hopeful for the future. All right, cool, what are you doing about it? What doors are you breaking down? Another way to think about hope in a meaningful sense, in a way that actually sees fulfillment and action and programs of change, is to think of hope as the necessary combination of two vital components: agency and pathways. So the educational developers, Peter Felton and Susanna McGowan, have formulated this sort of mathematical expression of hope in their attempts to try to answer the question, what does it mean to learn with hope? So in a collegiate context, right, one of the things that we struggle with at my university, and we are certainly not alone in this, is that students come to us a lot of times with academic struggles, in particular in math, STEM in general, but math courses in particular. And I'm not picking on my mathematician friends if there are any of them in here, but it is a thing. Math anxiety is a thing, right? And I was one of those students in my K-12 experience who was told basically that you're not a math person. It took me 4 tries to pass math as an undergraduate student in college. I came into math classes, as many of our students do now, in the literal sense, hopeless. I was there, but I did not think that a successful outcome would happen. I didn't think I would pass that class. So I was, in that sense, hopeless. I did not believe that a positive outcome could exist for me. And so if students come into class hopeless, how much learning can really occur? So what does it mean to give a student hope in a situation that they might regard as hopeless? And I might add, for very legitimate and rational reasons. If you have been told throughout your schooling, through K-12 and into college, you are not a math person, some people are good at math, you're not one of those. If you've always failed math, if you've always struggled with math, if you've always felt like it's impenetrable and obtuse and you can't understand it the way it's been taught, it is only reasonable to conclude those things. It's not some wild fantasy, it is the rational response to what students have been told. But we know from the research that this is a fixed mindset approach as opposed to a growth mindset, right? Nobody is fixed. We can always learn and do better, even in things that we don't think we could do that in. When we learn things, the neurophysiology of learning means that our minds are literally changing. Synapses and neurons are forging new connections, new pathways that help knowledge and cognitive activity transmit itself in ways that have not been done before. The more we do it, the better it gets. Now, there are a number of different ways to do that. People learn differently. Everybody learns differently. And so when a student says, I'm not a math person, what that really means is I'm not a math person yet, right? You don't just get to a ceiling and bump up against it. That's not how learning works. Everybody can learn. Everybody. So how do I tell that student, though, who's failed math 3 times and is now in their 4th attempt like I was? If I say, hey, let me tell you about neuroplasticity and growth mindset, like, what does that mean, right? I have to give the student meaningful hope. And that comes from those 2 characteristics here. Agency. That student has to know that not only is it possible, but I can take steps that will make this thing happen, this positive outcome happen. So we can't just say to the student, hey, you can pass this class, go get them, Bucky, because they've been told that before. So agency is part of the equation, but the pathways is the other part. So if I tell a student, if you work hard, you can pass this class. Well, the student's heard that before, and they've worked hard, and they've not passed that class. But they haven't known how to put that agency into place. So if you work hard by doing these things, let's seek out supplemental instruction. Let's look at problem-based learning. Let's look at extra time in the math lab. Let's look at ways of solving equations where you apply formulae in different contexts. If we start opening up different pathways, then hope becomes not abstract, but real. So hope is the product of agency and pathways. I have to know that I could move the needle, so to speak. But I also have to have some ideas about what that path or paths looks like for me to do that. And we often don't think about those things in tandem. Think about one of the most famous hopeful quotes that we have in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr.'s observation that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That arc doesn't bend itself. Hope without agency, right? How do we bend the arc? So hope is this commodity that unlocks possibilities within ourselves. And if we're educators, it unlocks possibilities within our students. And it unlocks possibilities thus in our society at large. Where is our agency? What are our pathways? Because those pathways are pathways to intervene in a set of processes that has been underway since before the United States was even the United States. Our history is defined in large part by the creation of structures of inequality. Whether it was the dispossession of indigenous Americans or the enslavement of Africans and African Americans, structures of inequality have always existed in this country. And the default process is that they reproduce themselves. So we go from enslavement to, after the Civil War, convict leasing, to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to racial disparities and mass incarceration that we see today. Structures of inequality reproduce themselves. The only way to stop that process of reproduction is by active intervention. That arc doesn't bend itself. So how will you intervene? This is the key component of not just a pedagogy of hope, but approaching what we're doing in these spaces of higher education, of higher learning, of our growth and development, of the strengthening of our own selves, but our community and our colleagues around us. How do we intervene to stop that process of reproduction? And that's where we get into the type of questions and the types of observations that many of us in colleges and universities across the country are already wrestling with, but maybe not in that larger coherent sense of, here's a question we have to deal with, but then we have to deal with this fire over here, this fire over here. And we're trying to answer all of these urgent questions, but we don't see how they unite. We don't see how they're converging on what it means to do this thing well with hope in a time of monsters. So in our COVID time of teaching in higher learning, what have we learned about our students? What have we learned about our students' learning that we can no longer ignore? And what are we going to do with that knowledge? So there were a lot of things that we could rationalize away before COVID, right? The digital divide, for example. We talk a lot about, learning being online. My own institution has expanded online learning and programs. We're trying to serve students in rural communities. We're trying to, get students to build 21st century job skills is the phrase that's used a lot, right? But what if that student doesn't have access to high-speed internet in their neighborhood? Even if they could afford it, their neighborhood alone doesn't have fiber optic cable. It has old telephone wire, right? So very basic questions that we had sort of ignored, right? Well, yes, there's a digital divide, but I could assign my students work that involves streaming or needs high-speed internet because we have computer labs on campus, or they can go to the local library, right? Well, that was great until COVID shut everything. And we moved most of our learning online, mediated through digital tools that required precisely the type of technology and internet access that many of our students now had unavailable at all. So what did we learn from that we could no longer ignore? But more importantly, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Because when we act in education, when we act without hope, we often act with fear. Fear is the opposite of hope when it comes to education and pedagogy. And when we make decisions based in fear, we often get to places that we do not wish to go. And when we arrive at those places, it's clear that we're in a place that is neither working for us or for our students, yet there we are. So an example of that might be the phenomenon that a lot of us observed as we moved online in the aftermath of sort of the first wave of the COVID pandemic. We all felt a loss of control acutely, right? I can't control my classroom anymore. Now we're online. Everything I designed for is different. And a lot of us react to that sense of a loss of control by clutching harder at the things that we think we can control, even if that's really an illusion of control. We become hoarders. We have a scarcity mentality. And where we saw that the most was a sense of control over our own individual class activities. And so a loss of control of our classroom and of the learning environment meant we had this explosion of discussion about Now that my students are online, they're all going to cheat. And we got to come up with ways to make them not cheat or punish them if they do. The research that we have on online learning suggests that levels of academic dishonesty in online, fully online classes are not any higher, statistically speaking, than they are in in-person classes. And for both of those cases, it's a product more of design of assessments than it is actual procedures. So we were reacting actually to the symptoms rather than the illness itself, but we craved control. And so we said students got to get on lockdown browsers. We're going to use proctoring technology so they take the test on webcam so we know that they're not cheating, because if they're cheating, it wouldn't be fair. And then we find out that some of these tools have massive security vulnerabilities that make students' computers vulnerable to hackers. And then we find out that some of these tools, AI interfaces and facial recognition technology, works actively against people of color. And then we find out that our students see them as massive invasions of privacy, because they are. But we make decisions based from fear, and we get to places like this. And the one consistent result was our students suffered, we suffered, and Proctorio made a lot of money. We are in the education business. Education comes from the Latin word educare, which means to draw forth or to draw out. And that speaks in many ways to kind of the fundamental reality of what learning is, right? The potential for learning and for knowledge and growth rests inside us and our students. The job of the skillful teacher and the job of the learner is to recognize that and draw that potential forth. It's already there. But you can't draw something out if it's locked behind a fence. And we put up a lot of fences in COVID teaching. So when we look at what does higher education look like going forward, what do we do now? Let me offer some provocations and some nudges, which in one sense is really easy for me to do, because I can come here and say whatever I want and poke at you and then I leave, right? And then you're left sitting there thinking, what are we going to do about what this guy said? But these are conversations that we're having at my university, and that colleges and universities of every stripe and every type of mission and student demographic are having across the country right now too. Our students are not who they were when we were in college. Our students are not younger versions of our own idealized academic self. College has changed. Learning has changed. We know more about learning than we ever did before. And what we also realize, thanks to historians of education in particular, is that American higher education has never been a space designed for diversity and inclusion. It was a system that was built to educate rich, white, colonial white men, mostly to become congregational ministers. That's where we get Harvard and Yale, right? The first colleges that open up in what becomes the United States. And even though faculty, students, and curricula have diversified and expanded in the few hundred years since then, the structure itself has remained largely the same. So when we think about the types of changes we need, how do we best serve our students? How do all of our students fulfill the promises that we make them when they enroll in our institutions? Diversity statements are not enough. It's not enough to say, hey, diversity is a thing, and we value diversity. All right, cool. How are you supporting it? Learning involves diversity. How are you supporting diverse learners? How are you supporting members of a community that was originally intended to be for one part of our society and is now attempting to serve larger parts of our society? Has that community's actions caught up with its mission? If we're writing diversity statements, I mean, that's good. I don't want to discourage that. But oftentimes as institutions, we think that that finishes the work rather than begins it. So when we undertake these kind of processes, one of the things that we hear right away is that we need to be open to the tough conversations. And so at my own university, for example, we had a task force convene that I had the pleasure of serving on, where we talked about we need to really dig deep and do actual justice and equity-oriented work. That is, go beyond the rhetoric and produce meaningful change where we better serve all of our students, not just some. And so one of the first things is we were talking about, well, what are the rules of the road for this group? What are we going to commit ourselves to? And here comes that phrase, right? Well, we need to be able to have the tough conversations. Okay? Cool. Let's have one now. Right? Are you really ready? So what if that conversation is, hey, let's look at the courses we have. We should be designing courses for our students, not in spite of them. Now that sounds like an obvious point, but think about the curricula that we have. Think about the predominant modes of instruction that we use. Think about the assumptions that underlie why a student should study a particular discipline, or choose a particular major, or progress through a particular academic program. Most often what those things represent are what we think should happen. And yes, the expert perspective is important, and yes, some sort of curricular structure is important, but when's the last time we revisited those foundational assumptions? A lot of times we talk about our classes, and I'm going to trip over this at some point, by the way. A lot of times we talk about our classes, our curricula, our academic programs in terms of what they cover, right? So this class will cover the French Revolution. This major covers these following professional outcomes. But covering content, that's what I do as an instructor. That is a purely instructor-oriented thing. What are students doing while I'm covering? Right? And that also masks the sort of assumptions that worms its way into this conversation. When we talk about coverage as the model that we use for instruction, the vision of learning that underlays that is basically if the student is in the same either physical or virtual space that I am when I talk about something, they've learned it. Right? But we know that's not how learning works. So when we talk about what do we do going forward? How do we infuse student-centered learning? We have to decenter ourselves in what we do and think a lot more about what it is that students do. So let's create spaces in that process then that foster meaningful and genuine presence. One of the most valuable things that we took out of pandemic pedagogy during COVID is the observation that, hey, community is really important in learning, and hey, it's really hard to do that online. Right? But there's a whole body of scholarly research in online teaching and learning about what's called social presence. And it's the key to effective learning and to meaningful courses in a fully online environment. And there are scholars and practitioners of online learning who've been studying it for decades. Let's translate those scholarly findings into the world of teaching and learning in general. There's a lot there, and I say this as an experienced online instructor, that informs my face-to-face practice, not just my online teaching. So let's foster spaces, and not just class spaces, but campus spaces, that foster meaningful and genuine presence. Not everybody just in the same space, but everybody present, fully present in those spaces. Because when it comes to our spaces, what do they say about where and how we think most meaningful learning occurs? We know in higher education that straight lecture for 50 minutes, 3 times a week, yes, it delivers content, but it is not the most effective way for students to learn that content. And in fact, if you read some of the research on lecture-oriented courses, there are findings with control groups and experiment groups that students have often forgotten almost all the specific content of a course within a semester of finishing it. That they could go back and take a final exam of a course, at the end of the spring for a course that they took in the fall and do just as poorly on that exam as a group that didn't take that course at all. I mean, to me, that's kind of an existential thing, because what are we doing if that's the outcome, right? Where and how does meaningful learning occur? We know that straight content delivery through a fire hose, that's not effective, yet we still do it. My teaching career, one of the earliest jobs I had was at the University of Houston, where my average class size was 490 students. That is not how learning works. So why are we still doing it? And I know the answers to that. I'm not naive. But it shouldn't be that way. Why do we have majors? Because don't we tell students interdisciplinary learning is all the rage in our own scholarly fields? Don't we talk about interdisciplinary scholarship and research being what solves the problems that we face in the 21st century? It was interdisciplinary research that gave us COVID vaccines, right? We say interdisciplinary learning, don't put yourself in just one bucket. Come to us and we will help you do that. And then when students come to us, we tell them to choose a particular discipline. Right? There's a misalignment between what we say is important about how learning works and what actually happens in the walls of our institution. We're not doing it out of malice. We're mostly doing it because it's always been done that way. Why are we still using curricular models like majors and pathways that are so narrowly tailored like this that are well over a century old? There may be a good answer to that, but we have not asked the question. Where, to whom, and how are we allocating resources at our institution? State funding, public funding of public institutions like y'all is at historically low levels. I'm at a small private tuition-dependent institution. We struggle mightily if we don't make enrollment goals. It is hard out there for higher education. Resources are increasingly scarce. And so, yes, it's easy for me to say, hey, we should do this and this and this and all these things that require money. But there does come a point with, even with the scarce resources that we have, how are we allocating them? And what do those choices say about what we're really after? Budgets are moral documents. Right? What's the apocryphal political quote? Don't tell me what you think is important. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you think is important, right? And so here's a nice little thought exercise. If you gave me your university budget, could I tell you generally what your mission statement says, just looking at the budget? Could I tell you what's important to you? Could I tell you what the university holds dear? I'll tell you right now, and I'll implicate ourselves. If I did this with my university, I doubt I could do that. And I know our university's mission statement. Are we aligned? Are we spending the resources we have on what is mission-driven work? Mission-driven. In the genuine sense, not the token sense. And so some of that is the infrastructure to support the meaningful learning that we say we're about, right? So one of the things that we have now realized, and higher education has certainly been at the leading edge of this in many ways, is that internet is infrastructure. So much of what we're doing in terms of the new world of teaching and learning and information and where we are now depends upon digitally mediated technology. But just like roads that can't handle the amount of traffic that are on them, our internet structure in this country is the same. It is overburdened and inequitably distributed. And so when we look at educational inequalities, what do we expect students to have? What opportunities have they had to develop those skills? Right? We need to start thinking about what is the infrastructure of learning. Because that learning that we're undertaking at its fundamental level is social. And again, this is what COVID showed us a lot, right? That everybody felt isolated, atomized, out on Zoom with the cameras off, and I felt like I was teaching the Hollywood Squares, except all the Hollywood Squares were anonymous. I mean, it's this weird, disembodied feeling. And people said, no, we get why we're doing it, but this isn't the way that it should be done. Learning is a social activity. We learn in community. We take in and process information individually, but it's what we do with that information, how we apply that information, that's what seals it in our memory. That's what gets us learning, cognitively speaking. And that's the stuff that we really can't do very well individually, that we must do in community. That doesn't mean in the same space physically. Communities can be virtual. Communities can be asynchronous. It's hard to build them in those environments, but it can be done. So as we look at what do we do going forward in higher education, how do we ensure that learning remains socially rooted in every way that we are asking our students to learn? Because if we are asking our students to learn across multiple modalities of hybrid, in-person, and online, and learning is not social in those environments or some of those environments, then our students are not learning well. And inequities are the result. Learning is a cognitive and an affective process. We need that social interaction emotionally as much as we do intellectually. When we think about academic programs and courses, so often we say this will promote student learning, but what we really think of students as in this point is brains on sticks, because all we talk about is the cognitive stuff. Here are the learning outcomes. Here are the skills that you will have as a result of this class. You'll be able to research. You'll be able to write a paper. You'll learn Java, whatever that is. What if we had course goals that say you will learn how to value knowledge? You'll learn how to care about this subject. You will learn why this matters. and be able to articulate that to someone who doesn't share that viewpoint. Why don't we have goals like that? When we talk about emotional impact on learning, motivation is an emotion. Excitement is an emotion. Curiosity is an emotion. Fear, anxiety, and stress are also emotions. In these conversations, we have to avoid the almost irresistible pull in the larger public discourse about higher education in places like the New York Times, for example, that insists on characterizing college students as self-centered, that this generation of students would rather be on TikTok than read Plato. Every generation of students, by the way, has found excuses not to read Plato. And in fact, Plato complains about that a lot in his own work, right? We cannot let this caricature of students be the image that we have when we think about student-centered learning. To use that oft-abused trope where students are seen as snowflakes, unable to deal with different opinions, not able to handle intellectual challenges. They cry for their safe spaces. That rhetoric offends me on an existential level. Students today, you all are still learning, still going to college in the midst of a global frickin' pandemic. That's not easy. Students today are learning what it looks like to see major social, political, and economic institutions fail them one by one by one. Students are learning that the way that I'm trying to do college today may not be the way that it's going to be next week. So we talk about grit and persistence and resilience and adaptability. Today's college students have that in spades. And they are being told by previous generations that they're worse off and it's all their fault. We cannot let that inform the conversations that we have. In particular, when it comes to student advocacy for resources on mental health and well-being, which are areas that higher education has failed to serve both its faculty and staff and students adequately in for generations. And in fact, in this regard, I think those of us in administrative positions can learn a lot from student advocacy in this area. Gil Scott-Heron wrote that the first revolution occurs when you change your mind. No is a revolutionary act. What if we said no to the dead ideas that still shape much of the practice that we undertake in higher education? What if we said no to business as usual? What if we said no to the same old tired tropes about efficiencies and started talking about mission? What if we said no to the public discourse which shames students and instead celebrated our students? What if we said no to delivery of content in favor of engagement with content? What if we decided to do things differently? Powerful revolutions start from changing one's mind. Because when we change our mind, not just, deciding one thing to another, instead of going to this grocery store, I'm going to go to that grocery store. But when we change our mind, what is our mind capable of conceiving, of thinking about, of recognizing? How do we imagine different? Every social and political reform movement in United States history has always been met with the criticism, you can't do that because things will crumble, collapse, society will end, whatever. So you can't give black people the right to vote, it would be the end of politics. You can't end slavery because our economy will crash. You can't do X because Y. That's not true. It's a failure of imagination. And our failure as a society today is that we cannot imagine better. We cannot imagine different. What does it look like to have a justice system whose first recourse isn't to throw people in cages? It will not make us descend into lawlessness and anarchy. But we can't imagine other alternatives. How do we imagine better? And again, this is what I think, and I'm going to use the word sacred, and I'm going to use it advisedly because I hold it at that level. This is the sacred trust of higher education. We can provide a model, an actual living, breathing example of what it means to do this. We're smart people doing smart things in smart communities. We can imagine different. We can imagine better. That is an ethic of hope. So my challenge to you is, as you go forward into thinking about what is next for you as a learner, as a teacher, as a member of this higher education community, commit radical acts of hope. Commit hope at the radical, that is the root fundamental level. Let your practice be informed by that action-oriented sense of hope that begins with changing your mind and maybe ends with breaking down the door with the axe in an emergency. Radical acts of hope. That is how we get forward. That is how we get free. So thanks for letting me be here today, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. Let's have a seat. All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was very inspiring. And we just have a few minutes to get this conversation going a little more, but we will continue it on the radio today at 3 p.m. You can tune in to KSUU Thunder 91.1. The first thing I have to say is an apology because I left out an important aspect of my introduction, and that is that this event is a collaboration with our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. And I want to say, first of all, I apologize for not mentioning it at the front, and to thank Matt Wegg and your office and really making this happen. I love our collaboration, and I hope to continue it for many years to come. So thank you so much for sponsoring this event and for bringing Kevin to us and introducing us and everything. So thank you, and for all the great work you do. And I apologize again for not saying at the beginning. Thank you so much. Yes. One question, again, it's so much to ask, but one thing that stuck out to me is when you were talking about the goals, for example, the goals to put for our outcomes in the class. I love that. I want to do those goals, but how do we get the word out so that that is okay to do when we have to have our essential learning outcomes and part of our strategic mission, part of our and all of these other things. So from a practical, so I have a teacher question and a student question. From a practical side of things, how do we do that? I can't just change my goals because I might leave out the information that we're supposed to have on the syllabus.
Well, maybe you could change your goals, right? And so the first thing, syllabi become, these sort of rapidly expanding things because they become the depository for all the legal language that we think everybody should read.
Right.
And then we complain ad nauseum that students don't read the syllabus. And it's because we haven't given them anything worth reading. We've given them basically the equivalent of an insurance policy in terms of the language, right?
Right.
And so the first thing that needs to happen is this conversation about who and what is the syllabus for. And what the job of any syllabus is to basically show the learner, here is how you will be different at the end of this thing than you are now. So learning is transformative, right? So you will be different when you hit point B than you are at point A. The stuff that gets in the way of that can go somewhere else. There's plenty of places on your website, your learning management system, that you can put institutional, boilerplate kind of language. The syllabus needs to contain those promises, right? And then that gives us room to talk about, what are the transformations of this course? You're going to learn specific content, we hope, but here is also how you will be different. And there are a number of different, there's a really robust body of literature on how we talk about learning and learning goals in ways that really underscore that work for students. I'm a big fan of D. Fink's taxonomy of significant learning, which addresses not just cognitive but affective dimensions. And Fink talks about we should be talking about the understand and remember stuff, but some of the dimensions on his taxonomy are caring and the human dimension and learning how to learn. And so for me, I found that's a really good way to organize how I want to frame the goals for my particular courses, so I'm conveying to students these larger dimensions. And there are a number of ways one can go about it, but you have to clear the ground for that to happen. Yeah,
I love it because I know for me, and maybe there's others in the room, we read the syllabus and we read the stuff, we're excited about the class, and then we say, and then, there's all that other stuff that you're seeing in every syllabus, be sure to read that, and So it'd be great. So powers that be in the room, I would love to, maybe investigate that conversation. I think that it could be very exciting from day one,
We had, at my institution, we had our institutional syllabus statements that had to be in there, and they were 7 pages.
Yeah.
They had just bloated out, right? And so that served nobody well. And so what we did is we offloaded most of that language onto our learning management system. It's a persistent link right there. We say in our syllabus, you're responsible for understanding the additional policy statements on Blackboard. Boom, done.
Okay.
And that's one practical way. Leverage the technological resources you have to clear the space for the meaningful learning stuff in a document that is oftentimes our students' first contact with us in our course, and first impressions matter.
Right, great. The other part of the teacher question that I have has to do with how do you, in your dealings with teachers and instructors, how do you answer the question when someone comes to you and says, this all sounds great, but I am absolutely overwhelmed by the sense of responsibility of all this. I really got into this because I just wanted to teach this subject that I'm passionate about, and now I feel a constant pressure of responsibility to include all these things and be perfect all the time. How do you help instructors with that feeling?
That's a great question. And so 2 thoughts come to mind. First is that this is in some ways a larger institutional question about how are we supporting faculty and staff? Do we have places for faculty to work together and collaborate and be in community with one another? Because all too often it feels like we're doing this alone, and that's what leads to those feelings of being overwhelmed and all of these responsibilities. Because some of the responsibilities, schools in general are the social safety net for many of our students, and it sucks that it's that way, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. And figuring out how to do that well is tough, and nobody does that work alone without burning out, right? And like the cliche goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. But the second thing I would suggest too is thinking about, this type of approach to pedagogy isn't one more thing, right? It's not another thing on the list. It's a way to think about what you're already doing and give it coherence and give it a center of gravity and give it a focus. And so when I'm like, I got to do a syllabus and I got to plan Tuesday's class and I got to grade these papers and figure out this, it feels like I'm flitting from one discrete thing to another, and I'm exhausted by the process. But if I'm putting them together into this is a practice that I'm doing informed by these ethics, right? And all of this work is important. These are the bricks that build the structure for me. And so I'm not doing more, I'm just focusing what I'm doing and doing it better and doing it. I'm a big fan of thinking about doing things with intention and doing things with mindfulness, right? And sometimes people say, well, that sounds really new agey and stuff. But I think it's important, why am I doing what I'm doing right now? Do I have a compelling reason for that? And if I don't, I really need to examine what's happening and why it's happening. And so thinking about things in that way, then what we do is we model that for students as well. Part of the pressure we put on ourselves is try to appear as if we have all the answers, that we're the experts all the time. What our students need from us is to model that we too are human. And we're trying to do this thing well as they are. And it's okay to not do that all the time. And it's okay to fail.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful. It goes really to what you started with, which was the lens that you look at things with, right? If you analyze that lens and adjust that lens, that can help. On the student side of it, I wonder what advice you have for students in the room to, for their part of it. It's a collaborative social entity. What sort of advice do you have for them as they navigate this?
That's a really good question. And anytime I think about this question, I do so with the realization that I will turn 50 this year. And so there's a real vibe of like, hey, fellow kids, like, what I would tell today's student, get your money's worth, right? And in the broader sense of the term, like you are in an area, in an institution with enormous amounts of possibilities and options. You will likely never be in a place again where you have all of these learning opportunities literally next door, right? You could take a course in X or Y. What are you going to have the opportunity to do that again? So take advantage of where those opportunities present themselves to you in ways that are authentic to you. What does success mean to you? Figure that out, right? Success can be a good job. We live in a capitalist society. I too like to eat. Those things are important. But is that all that's going to define you? Are you going to work your job 24/7? Are you going to take a job that wants you to work like that? Be your agent, be your advocate. What matters to you? What helps you be successful? What lights your spark? What turns on the light bulb? What do you enjoy, right? Being able to think about those things and then connecting the opportunities that you have to move further down those paths. That's, that so often is something that we always say, oh, I'll do that later, and then we never get to it, right? So I would think about it in the sense of being in this environment and having all these opportunities for you. The most precious resource you all have is time. There's so many demands on your time. And so how are you spending that time, that precious resource? Is it in ways that matter? Is it in ways that complete you, that make you feel whole, that harmonize? What are your values? Is what you're doing resonating with your values? If you believe that here's how the world becomes a better place, are you on a path that will let you do those sorts of things? And so maybe you're thinking my values aren't in alignment with some of the stuff that's happening or some of what I'm doing. How might I bring those things in alignment? Those are the really heavy questions that are the point of college, right? And so don't be afraid to undertake that kind of reflective process. Don't be afraid, and don't be afraid to reach out to others for collaboration, for comradeship, for assistance, for perspective. Again, nobody does this alone. And the rest of us are here, whether it's fellow students or faculty and staff, to help you do precisely those things. So let us help. Let us help you do that.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And as I said, we've just scratched the surface and we're already out of time. I can't wait to continue the conversation. And thank you for all of that advice, both on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. Okay. So thank you for inspiring us today. And as you know, we will have books for sale in the lobby here, and Kevin will be available to sign them if you like. And stay tuned on the radio for Today at 3. But for now, that's it for us. Thank you again, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.